Good evening, Western Standard viewers, and welcome to Hannaford, a weekly politics show. I'm Jen Hodson, filling in for Nigel Hannaford while he's away on holiday. It's Thursday, July 10th, 2025, and my guest today is Francis Widdowson, political analyst and wrongfully terminated professor at Mount Royal University. More on that during this interview. Francis and her team released a documentary called What Remains, where they went to Kamloops, where 215 bodies were alleged to be found. However, to this day, no bodies have been found and no remains reported to be excavated. Francis has been on a relentless pursuit of truth about what happened in Kamloops and has experienced one closed door after another. Today, she will recount her investigation to date so Canadians can decide for themselves what really happened in Kamloops and with all of these alleged remains of children from indigenous schools from the last century or more. So, Francis, thank you for joining us today in the studio.
Thank you for having me on.
My great pleasure. So, let's just go back to the beginning and talk about what inspired you to go on this journey of investigating what actually did happen in Kamloops. We know that allegations came out from mainstream media, which the Trudeau Liberals at the time, they jumped on this. Federal flags, Canadian flags were raised to half-mast that summer. For several months, Justin Trudeau made a public outcry about it. The Pope came and made a formal apology. So what is it that struck you that something wasn't right? And tell us how you got started.
Yes, so when I was a professor at Mount Royal University, one of the reasons why I got pushed out of Mount Royal was because of my stance on the residential schools and my opposition to the argument that the residential schools were genocidal. So I was busy criticizing this position, which had become official policy at Mount Royal University. General Faculty's Council had voted to declare that the residential schools were genocidal. I was very opposed to this, so I had been studying this for quite some time since the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Report. Mm-hmm. So when the announcement was made, because of my awareness of the kinds of fabrications that often were going on with respect to this issue, I was a bit skeptical about this announcement, and I wasn't sure what to think of it. I thought perhaps it was an abandoned cemetery. That's often the case, that there are many cemeteries in Canada where the grave markers have deteriorated, and you see these, in fact, on Aboriginal reserves. And in the case of the Kamloops Reserve, there is a cemetery on that reserve, and many of the markers are no longer there. So I held an event with Brian Giesbrecht and Rod Clifton and Paul Viminitz in, I believe it was July 10th, 2021.
Right at the beginning.
Yes, yeah. Called Can We Discuss Those Unmarked Graves? Mm-hmm. And, the answer was, well, we're discussing them right now, but you do so at your peril, because you will be attacked and you'll be told that you're a racist and you are a person who doesn't care about Aboriginal people. And that was the kind of thing that was happening until I eventually was pushed out of Mount Royal University. So I've been fighting for the truth with respect to Aboriginal policy and other issues which would be characterized as woke, which is identity politics that has become totalitarian. Yeah. And with respect to this issue, we are now 4 years in, and the time is now. $12.1 million have been allocated to do the excavations at Kamloops. Many people think that the excavations have been done, but they have not. And we do not have one parent who has said that their child never came home from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. So if there are remains in that apple orchard, who would those remains belong to? Who would the people who have been murdered or some kind of foul play that has gone on, that has resulted in those remains being there? Because there is a cemetery on the Kamloops Reserve, so any remains that would be in that apple orchard would be clandestine burials, and we need to find out if there are actually people buried in that apple orchard.
Mm-hmm. Now, so these claims were made early on by first indigenous groups, picked up by media, picked up by politicians, until it became like a whole machine that became dangerous to speak out against. So your job was threatened, and you've had all kinds of different experiences of resistance around this. So maybe my question is two faceted. So at what point did it become this claim that couldn't be refuted? And what is it that continues to drive it? And what do you think it is that sets you apart from so many other people that just go along with what they have heard, that, you know, your receptacles went up and you realize that something's not right here. There's some lie going on. So how do you interpret that system that you're up against?
Well, I think it's always been very difficult to challenge the claims that are being made by what would be called the Aboriginal industry and the associated neo-tribal elites, who are the Aboriginal leaders that are associated with the Aboriginal industry. But it became much, much worse in 2020. That's when we saw the real sort of authoritarian push start to, you know, take hold in universities, beginning with the George Floyd situation. And then, of course, COVID made things much more difficult in terms of people not being present in person. And the unmarked graves kind of claims really followed on that. And so what you would find is that there was arguments being made, and they still are being made by people like Leah Gazan, that if you criticize the stories that are being put forth by what's called residential school survivors, and even that language is very loaded, you should be charged. You should be criminally charged and receive up to 2 years in prison for making counterclaims and demanding evidence.
Yeah, even questioning.
Asking questions. And Leah Gazan, when she gave a talk in Powell River, which is, you know, the What Remains documentary is looking at how the Kamloops claim played out in Powell River. She said that she could think of nothing more violent than a person who was a residential school student saying this is what they think happened, and you would tell them that you disagreed with them and did not think that what they were claiming was true. She said that was the most violent thing that she could even imagine, which is shocking because, of course, we know of many, many terribly violent acts that have happened in human history. The Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, the death squads in Latin America, all sorts of wars. And for someone like Leah Gazan, who's a member of parliament, to be making this kind of claim is just absolutely absurd.
Absolutely. To enshrine it into law that you can't ask questions about something. And it just makes one wonder, where is this coming from and what is the motive? Is it based off of some kind of faux compassion? Or is it something more sinister? You know, some people might say, well, follow the money. And so indigenous groups have been allocated, I think you said 12.1 million to perform these evacuations. But yet very few excavations, very few excavations have been done, and nothing has been found. So wouldn't it serve the case of those that are perpetuating this unmarked graves claim that they could actually find some remains? So why aren't we seeing more work being done about that?
Yes, so there's been massive amounts of funds that have been distributed. I believe it was $320 million for across Canada for groups to pursue trying to find what they call missing children. And Kimberly Murray, who's the special interlocutor, who, again, millions of dollars spent to have her be, investigating this matter. She said in 2023 in a committee meeting that there are no missing children, that the children are in cemeteries. So what you have is you have children in cemeteries where people don't exactly know where in that cemetery that child was buried. That's the issue. And it could be because the grave markers have disappeared. It could be because the record keeping wasn't as accurate as we would like. But that's a completely different scenario than saying that children were murdered and they just went missing and we have no idea what happened to those children. So I think that's a big confusion that is happening with respect to this issue. But because of the money that's involved, obviously, if it's found that in the case of Kamloops, there are no remains there, it's going to open up to question all the other kinds of ground penetrating radar searches that have been happening across the country. As well, there was a whole bunch of lawsuits that got fast-tracked because of the Kamloops claim. In Powell River, which is what Remains was investigating, the fallout, the impact. In that case, there's a demand that the name of Powell River be changed because of the Kamloops case. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the federal legislation got fast-tracked because of the Kamloops case. So there's all sorts of Aboriginal industry initiatives that people were sort of resisting and were not, were questioning whether they should go ahead. When the Kamloops claim was announced, that just pushed aside all opposition. And now we have a completely different, policy regime with respect to Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal relations, which is going to have massive consequences for Canada as a country.
Wow, that's fascinating. And so before we get any further into the issue, why don't we talk about this documentary, What Remains? Yes. So you went to Kamloops, you were at Thompson Rivers University there. Why don't you tell us about your experience? Our viewers might be interested to know a little background about the documentary before they check it out. And we will link beneath this video so people can easily access that documentary. So why don't you give us some background?
What Remains is sort of the first installment of probably is going to be a series. Great. So What Remains was looking at the case of Powell River. So what happened is that the Kamloops announcement was made in May 2021. Immediately, there was a demand that the name of Powell River be changed, and a lot of other kinds of initiatives were pushed through. So what happened is that Simon Hergott, who's the incredible videographer who did the videography for What Remains, he and I traveled to Powell River, and we just covered a talk that I gave about the Kamloops case and the lack of evidence for the claim that the remains of 215 children have been found, and also did interviews in Powell River and looked at things like this sign that they have, the Tla'amin Nation, which is the Aboriginal group there, has this sign which says 10,068. So we were investigating what this meant, this number 10,068. We also went and, because the newspaper of Powell River, which is called The Peak, the publisher of that newspaper, Kelly Keel, refused to carry the advertisement for the talk that I was going to be giving in Powell River, but had actually done a, sort of an overview of the talk that Leah Gazan gave in January. And when Kelly Keel was asked to explain the difference, she said that the book Grave Error, which the talk was going to be relating to, was full of misinformation, and her paper did not, give an audience, they would not give credence to all this misinformation that would be provided in the talk that I was giving, which is completely factually based. So he went to The Peak and tried to ask questions about that. So there's a lot of kinds of episodes where we're going around trying to, investigate what happened in Powell River. So What Remains is the first installment. And then in May of this year, which is 2025, Simon, who's from Kamloops and actually was a journalist who got fired from Global News for sort of resisting the kinds of propagandistic coverage that was occurring. He's been very interested in the Kamloops case and thought that it didn't make sense at the time, the claim, but his employer was not interested whatsoever in having a critical view on this. We went to a number of different areas in Kamloops to try to develop a fuller picture of why there was this massive institutional failure that happened with respect to the perpetuation of this deception. Because I really do see it was a deception. It just is seeming more and more that it wasn't just an accident that these claims are being made, that in fact there was an orchestrated effort to try to deceive the Canadian public. And so one of the most fascinating things that happened was, because at Thompson Rivers University, which is the university in Kamloops, has been actively involved in perpetuating this falsehood. In fact, as recently as 2024, so that's not that long ago, we've known since July 2021 that there were no remains found. It was at the presentation by Sarah Bollier where she actually stated this. But Thompson Rivers University has continued to say that children's bodies have been found at Kamloops. So we decided on the anniversary to go into Thompson Rivers University and do a Spectrum Street epistemology session on the claim the remains of 215 children have been found. And when we went into that university, we were met by 4 members of the safety division who told us that because we were on the House of the Kamloops, that we should not be having this discussion take place at Thompson Rivers University. And we said to them, well, we're staying. You have been perpetuating misinformation. Your president has been doing it. And it is in the public interest that this discussion takes place. So you do what you have to do, but we're going to stay here and we're going to do this event. And they just disappeared.
Wow.
These administrators.
So their attempt to stifle this information, actually, it works against them in the long run, because, and this goes back to, and I'll ask you in a moment about tours that you've done in the East, in Ontario, and also about what happened at Mount Royal University, where you were employed, I believe, with tenure.
Yes.
Wow. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience going and doing these speaking tours, raising awareness about the fact that actually no remains had been found, and the stifling of your speech and your pursuit for truth at Mount Royal. And maybe then we can get into a bit more of an analysis on what is going on here with this stifling of speech. Like, what is this systematic machine that, apparently driven by the woke left in order to have their say? And this, of course, pours out into other issues like the trans issues and all kinds of different facets in our society. So maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit more for context for our viewers.
Yes. So wokeism, which is what has sort of taken hold in many universities in Canada, which is identity politics that has become totalitarian. So it's not really associated with what would have traditionally have been considered to be the left, which is like something which is concerned about economic equality. It's about these subjective identities, such as men who believe that they're women, or in the case of Aboriginal policy, the genocide survivor identity. So Aboriginal people who believe that they are survivors of genocide. The idea of wokeism in universities is that you must affirm that identity, even if you believe it's not true. So if you don't believe that a man can become a woman and you say so, you will be subjected to all sorts of harassment investigations and perhaps a human rights investigation. And then the same thing to do with the Aboriginal policy and the whole idea of the residential schools being genocidal, is that questioning that will be seen as harassment and will be seen as making Aboriginal scholars and students not feel safe. And in order for those members of what's considered to be oppressed groups to feel that they belong at a university, people who question them have to be removed. And that's basically what happened to me. And it's still being argued that I should not be reinstated because I claim that there are only two sexes. And I am critical of the view that there's such a thing as indigenous science. This was revealed at the arbitration hearing as to why I cannot be reinstated, because there's this friction that exists between me and my colleagues. But the friction is that my colleagues cannot tolerate, some of my colleagues cannot tolerate views that are critical of theirs. And that is the huge kinds of issue that's going on. So what happens is I've been trying to give talks on academic freedom in my case, and also the Kamloops, the grave error at Kamloops. That was the other talk. And when I try to give these talks, what happens is that in University of Regina and the University of Lethbridge, my talks were canceled because it was claimed that they would cause harm to people in the university. And in Regina, it was that it was a safety and security threat.
And so let me, if you don't mind me just interrupting.
Yes.
So what is this harm? What is this safety threat? You mentioned it a few moments ago too, that these safety teams are approaching you and saying that we can't have you speaking out about these things. When did, especially in the university setting, when did words become a weapon, and when did the university stop becoming a beacon of liberty and free speech and open discourse?
Yes. Well, it started about, you really noticed the change in 2014. There is a social scientist whose name is Jonathan Haidt. He and Greg Luciano wrote a book called The Coddling of the American Mind. And they're talking about this safetyism kind of mentality, which is connected to a particular kind of parenting style. But what you find is that it's not safety, this psychological safety, so that people should be protected from hearing views that are upsetting to them, that they find offensive, these sorts of things. But it's not everyone. Like, that's kind of the key issue, is that not everyone, it's argued, that should be made to feel safe. So, for example, if I'm putting forth a critical viewpoint and so on about Aboriginal policy or trans activism, no one cares about whether I feel safe or not.
Exactly.
They care about the people who are putting forward the views about trans activism, or that the Aboriginal residential schools were genocidal. So it's tied up with the whole woke mentality, which is the argument that in order for Aboriginal people, trans people you identify as trans, to empower themselves, they need to have people affirm who they are. And that's going to be what is going to empower them to overcome their oppression. So there's a lot of arguments that you'll see in the universities that are really oriented towards trying to stop people from critically analyzing the views of these selected groups. And that really came into existence in, beginning in around 2010, and then getting worse and worse and worse until 2020. And then it just became completely authoritarian, and you're not allowed to question anything anymore.
And our former Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has been a great perpetrator of these issues, like the woke issues. We see him, coming out with all of this dismay about the so-called remains that were found, even though remains were never found, this emotional support that we see for the trans crowd and the pride crowd and everything like this. And I think reasonable Canadians, they love and accept Indigenous people and people of different gender identities. That's not really the issue. You mentioned that the issue is that these people need to be affirmed. And so I think that's a very fascinating seed to pick apart, because you see it being infiltrated more and more into our society. So schools have the pride flags. For the last few weekends, we've seen pride parades in city streets with grown men walking around essentially naked. In terms of the indigenous stuff, the land acknowledgements before hockey games or any kind of civil event. And not just land acknowledgements now, but prayers and drum circles that is quite expected to be accepted by common Canadians and taken on as their own, which further undermines the identity of Canadians. So many of these micro compromises need to take place.
Yes.
So how do you see things progressing in the next 5 years or so? Like, what needs to happen for Canada to get its roots down again and to not be so offended over these ideas, and that people can really focus on what matters, like individual identity and freedom and family and faith, whatever people's faith might be? What needs to happen in order to see a return to that kind of saneness in Canada?
And it's a widespread, it's a very, very deeply entrenched problem, because it's not just the Liberals and Trudeau that were responsible for this. For example, with the genocide claim, all members of the House of Commons declared that the residential schools were genocidal.
That's an important point to make. It's not just one party.
No, and so it seems to be something that is really deeply ensconced within the political and legal fabric. In terms of fighting against it, Mia Hughes, who is, I spent some time with her in Ottawa, talking about the trans issue. And we actually went to Parliament Hill and during the pride flag raising ceremony and made all sorts of criticisms of it there and did some Spectrum Street epistemology there. She said that she was hoping for a social contagion of courage amongst people. And Catherine Cronus, about the land acknowledgements, just did something very simple. Just made the school board take note that she did not agree with this practice. And so people can do those sorts of things. Just let it be known that you don't have to be nasty or disruptive or anything. You just let people know. And courage begets courage, cowardice begets cowardice. And so if you're able to find space to just make it be known that you don't agree, other people will be watching, and they might take some courage from that. In terms of the university, the weapon, because they cancel talks, they seem to be allowed to do that because they have control over their space. The weapon in universities is what's called Spectrum Street epistemology. You don't need space. You just take in these 7 mats, disagree, agree, neutral. You lay those mats out and you have claims like we did at Thompson Rivers University, which is the remains of 215 children have been found. That was the claim. Do you strongly agree with that? Do you strongly disagree with that? And we had Jenna, who was a person who taught international students there. She was in strong agreement because she thought excavations had been done. Hal was in strong disagreement because he was saying that there's only been ground penetrating radar that's been done. And that's not an indication of remains. And so we had this incredible conversation between Jenna and Hal with me moderating, which allowed all of us to come to a better understanding. And we reached the conclusion that what was needed was excavations at the Kamloops site to come to an understanding of whether remains were actually there or not. So every single professor who's concerned about this, every student who's concerned about this in universities, just get out those Spectrum Street epistemology mats and start talking about these claims, which are now, not being discussed because of the terrible climate of self-censorship that exists at universities. And most people, I do not think rational people, agree that a university should be an area where everyone's afraid to state what they think is true. Because if we can't do it at the university, we're not going to be able to do it anywhere in Canada, and we will lose the liberal democratic features that have made our country able to function so well in the past.
How disappointing if that would be the case.
Yes.
Yes. Well, you also offer a story of hope that there is a way for Canadians to start being honest with one another. And it's a terrible story that was told about these alleged remains, but it's still just a story as it is now. So unfortunately, we do have to wrap up soon. We could talk about this all evening, I'm sure. But first, before we let you go, why don't you just let me know what people can expect? You said that this was a series of documentaries.
Yes.
So what are you looking to focus on in the next one? And maybe you can also just let us know about what's happening with Mount Royal University, the appeals process,
yes,
before we wrap it up today.
Yes. So the second documentary is going to be actually on what happened in Kamloops. We have a number of different we have a whole bunch of footage that we took in Kamloops. And so we're currently sifting through that footage, trying to shape it into different stories. One of them, of course, is about the university and how this was a major factor in the perpetuation of the falsehood, Thompson Rivers University. But we also have the school board and the role that the school board played. We have the media, which played a terrible role in Kamloops. And
there's been no retractions, no apologies, and they published it as though it were fact.
Yes.
And that is a huge blow to journalistic integrity.
Yes.
And other publications, and not just in Canada, but across the world.
Exactly.
Picked up on this big scandal that turns out to be baseless.
Yes. And Kamloops CFJC, that's the outlet, got the scoop to announce this claim. James Peters, who is the person who got the scoop, he's continued to say things like being skeptical. There's only one reason that people are skeptical is because they're racist, these kinds of claims. So that would be good to do a segment on the media. And so the coverage to some extent is going to shape that, but we're hoping to have a series of, instances of institutional failure that allowed this falsehood to be perpetuated. And in terms of my case, it's being appealed to the Alberta Labor Relations Board, and Mount Royal University will be held to account for what it did with respect to my case. And even if we are not successful, I would like, it to go as far as the Supreme Court of Canada, and to have all these judges put down their reasoning as to why that was an acceptable outcome, to push a tenured professor out of that institution who was just asking questions and trying to pursue the truth. But because those questions were disliked by various scholar activists in that institutions, I can no longer be able to return to Mount Royal University. Wow. And if my case is not successful, universities are over.
What a precedent
Canada.
It would set.
It would just be an absolutely terrible precedent. We have to do everything that we can to make sure that I can get reinstated at Mount Royal University. I can return to that university tomorrow and completely be functional doing my teaching and my research. And that because of these scholars who say they feel unsafe when I'm there, they're claiming that cannot happen.
Wow. What a case for our times. So all the best to you on that, Francis. And we look forward to following up with you as things progress and when the next segment of your documentary comes out. So thanks so much for joining us in the studio, speaking with us about what's going on with all of this. And we look forward to having you back again soon.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.